And welcome. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Appreciate you taking valuable time out of your day to hear some incredibly valuable information. So this is key updates on WIOA funding, federal policies that are impacting our world of adult education. And we are beyond thrilled, one of my favorite people to follow. And if you don't already follow our presenter, I would definitely go on LinkedIn right now and do that. So Amanda Bergson-Shilcock from National Skills Coalition will be our presenter today. And obviously, with everything going on, I couldn't think of a better place to find information right here. Amanda is an incredibly recognized, nationally renowned presenter on all of these topics. And once again, if you don't follow National Skills Coalition, and Amanda, you should. So especially during these times where things seem to be changing at the minute. Just a few housekeeping items. And again, Robert Breitbart here, Director of Educational Partnerships with Burlington English. The webinar will be recorded and on our website, down at the bottom of our page, burlingtonenglish.com, is our archives of our webinars. You will be receiving follow-up email from us at the shortly after the conclusion of today's webinar, where we will provide you with a certificate of attendance along with the PowerPoint that Amanda will be sharing today. So be on the lookout for that. And lastly, for today's webinar, while we do have some time set aside at the end for questions and answers, if you do have some questions or comments, please use the chat to share them. And if you will, also include your email too, because if we don't get back to everyone's questions, we'll provide that with Amanda, and then we'll send out an email to everybody with answers in that. So with that, I'm going to turn this webinar over to Amanda, and thanks for your valuable time today. Amanda, I'll let you take it from here. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Hello, everyone. I'm getting over laryngitis, so my apologies in advance for the fact that my voice is a little less strong than usual, and you'll see my cough drops. But I have a lot of useful information to share with you, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you. I want to say thank you to Burlington for the opportunity to be presenting this information to all of you today. It is really close to my heart to be talking to folks who are working directly with adult learners in the field. I know many of you are instructors, program administrators, program directors. Some of you may be state agency leaders, community college leaders, nonprofit folks. I'm going to make the slides full screen here so it's a little easier for folks to see. Um, and it's always really important to me that the work that I'm doing in the federal and state policy conversations that I'm a part of is really closely connected to organizations and people doing the work on the ground. So thank you for being here today to be part of that. Okay, we have a packed agenda today. We're going to talk a little bit about federal funding and where things currently stand. I'm going to share some potential good news for adult learners around the Workforce Pell provision that passed in federal law recently. And then I'm going to walk through some potential challenges related to work requirements under SNAP and Medicaid and under the immigration public charge regulations. I have left plenty of time for Q&A, so don't be shy to ask your questions. And anything we don't have time to get to today, the amazing and wonderful team behind the scenes of Amy and Mia, as well as Robert in front of the scenes, will make sure that I get those questions and can follow up afterwards. Okay, so let's talk about federal funding. Now, for some of you, this is going to be old hat, and for some of you, it may be new information. I always like to start with a baseline. Federal funding for adult education is authorized under a piece of legislation that is called WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. You'll also hear this same legislation referred to as AFELA, the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act. And as many of you no doubt are very familiar, this money flows from the federal government to the states and then gets regranted to local partners on the ground who might be community colleges or nonprofit community-based organizations or other adult education provider partners. Okay, the federal fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. And again, I know some of you know this kind of intimately well, but not everyone does. And I do always like to just kind of clarify it for folks. And the reason I like to do that is because the state fiscal year runs from July 1 to June 30th. And you may have noticed that while those are both 12-month time periods, they are not the same 12-month time period. And so when we think about adult education funding, adult ed is generally what we call forward funded. And so, in general, what that means is funding from the federal government that is passed in one year is not used to cover adult education programs until the next fiscal or programmatic year starts in that state. What that really means in practice is we have a little bit of extra breathing room if there is a federal budget standoff or a government shutdown in terms of the flow of those funds. I'm not going to go into great detail about this because it's pretty complicated and it's probably more detail than everyone really cares about at this moment. But, I really do. I'm going to, emphasize this again, right? The federal year runs October through September. The state year runs July through June. And so you're doing this forward funding situation. So where are we right in this very moment? Congress has passed some of the 12 spending bills that together make up the whole federal budget. The bill we quite care about as adult education leaders is the Labor Ed HHS bill. It just rolls right off the tongue there. Such a nice, easy to say name there. Congress, at least as of an hour ago, had not yet passed this bill. However, they had passed a key procedural provision, which means they are likely to pass the bill either today or possibly tomorrow. So technically, the federal funding for the Labor Ed HHS programs is paused as of last Saturday, which was January 31st. But in reality, we are anticipating this will be a very brief pause, and that bill will likely be reauthorized this afternoon. It may even have been reauthorized in the hour or so since I last checked the news. Now, you may all have seen headlines about the controversy about the DHS bill for Department of Homeland Security funding for ICE. That is a separate one of the 12 spending bills. It is not part of the Labor Ed Health and Human Services bill. And so whatever news headlines you're seeing about the Homeland Security funding are distinct from the Labor Ed bill. Again, I know this is a lot of kind of arcane inside baseball. For some of you, you're just like, I'm focused on my learners and trying to keep my program running. I just wanted to give you some really important kind of big picture context so that as you're seeing news headlines, you know how to assess them in terms of the impact on your programs and your learners. I'm going to pause here for just a second and I'm taking a quick look at the chat. I think folks have mostly been introducing themselves. But I'm just checking to make sure there's no clarifying questions that folks have been asking about. I do see Martin asking the question of what funding changes should adult ed programs prepare for this year. At this point, I would say actually none, in that we anticipate that we are going to see effectively level funding. We'll see as things shake out over the next few days, but in this exact moment, I would anticipate that it will be, at least as far as funding is concerned, relatively status quo. Okay. I don't see any other questions in the chat at this moment
And
related to the budget.
quickly,
Yeah.
Amanda, Robert here. Got two quick items. Where can we find the most up-to-date news regarding the labor at HHS bill? And then should we continue to be contacting our congressional reps to encourage support for this?
Okay. So second question first. Yes, keep contacting Congress, and here's why. Even though Congress is voting today on the FY26 spending bill, FY27 is around the corner. They got to keep hearing from you. So absolutely continue to contact your legislators. And I'm so sorry, Robert. The first question was,
Where can they keep up
oh,
with the
yeah,
latest?
where can you
Sure.
keep up with the news? So you have kind of three options. Option one is the mainstream media, and there I would recommend the Associated Press. Um, AP news articles are picked up by local newspapers all over the country, but they have Washington-based reporters who are pretty good. So you can just visit the Associated Press website, and those are pretty good updates. You can also look at more specific Washington news media, so sites like Politico or the Washington Post politics page. The danger with those is that they often use kind of inside baseball terms, and so it may not be as immediately clear as a mainstream news article would be. And then if you really want to know the specifics for um, the implications for education and workforce leaders, I would follow National Skills Coalition on LinkedIn because my colleague Megan does amazing updates about Capitol Hill developments from the perspective of our member organizations. So Associated Press for general news, uh, folks like Politico or Washington Post, uh, Capitol Hill coverage for DC specific stuff, and then National Skills Coalition's LinkedIn page. I did see a question in the chat about whether there was voting that happened yesterday. Yes, there have been multiple rounds of votes. I didn't get into the details of this because some of this is also really detailed procedural stuff in Congress that is kind of not voting on actual bills, but is voting on the procedure by which the bill will be voted on. And honestly, that's a level of detail that most of us thankfully don't need to pay close attention to. Um, so I didn't try to summarize all of that. Um, in terms of the reauthorization of WIOA, I see Nancy's question in the chat. Um, so at the moment, WIOA was last passed in 2014. And so it's funded now in annual appropriations, but it hasn't been reauthorized as a piece of legislation in 12 years, give or take. I have heard varying things about whether Congress has the appetite to try to move a WIOA reauthorization bill in this Congress. I think they're going to run out of time. And I don't think the Senate has much appetite for it. The House might have some appetite, but I don't know that the Senate does. And I don't know they have enough time on the calendar to do it by the end of this calendar year when this Congress comes to an end. Um, I'm also seeing a note from Scott in the chat, back to appropriations for a second. Looks like the appropriations bill has passed the House now and is going to the president for signature. So that is good news. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section of my presentation now, and we'll have time for more questions coming soon. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Workforce Pell. So that big piece of budget reconciliation legislation that Congress passed last summer had a lot of things in it. And you might have seen a lot of news coverage of this bill. But one of the things it had in it was an expansion of the Pell Grant program so that people can use Pell Grants to cover shorter term programs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who's eligible to receive this funding, what it looks like, and then what adult educators might want to do next. There are three factors to think about. The first is the organization eligible? That is the organization running the program. The second is the student or the learner eligible? And the third is the program eligible? So organizations have to be accredited and eligible under the Higher Education Act. typically this is going to mean community colleges. Most nonprofits are not accredited under HEA. There are a couple of exceptions. Some of you may be familiar with Instituto del Progreso Latino in Chicago or the Center for Employment Training, which has locations in California and Texas. But generally speaking, most nonprofits are not already HEA eligible or are accredited as higher education institutions. In addition to the organization being eligible, students or learners themselves also have to be eligible. Um, so Pell Grants are intended to support low-income students, so there are eligibility requirements around income, there are eligibility requirements around how many classes you're taking, things like that. Um, the people who qualify for Pell as far as immigration is concerned are U.S. citizens, permanent residents, which are green card holders, and other eligible non-citizens, which is a kind of term of art that is defined in federal law, and I've linked that on the slide here. But for our purposes, you can pretty much assume that your students who are refugees or who have been granted asylum, not not applied for asylum, but actually been granted asylum, um, would count in that eligible non-citizen category. One big change is that in general, if you've already earned a bachelor's degree, you're not eligible for Pell Grant funding. But for Workforce Pell, even if you've already earned a bachelor's degree, whether in the United States or somewhere else, you are actually eligible for Workforce Pell. That's a big change. We can talk more about that if folks have questions. And then in terms of the specific programs that are eligible, they have to be between 8 and 15 weeks long and between 150 and 599 hours in length. They have to have been up and running for at least a year before they apply to be eligible to get federal funding. They have to provide post-secondary skills training that leads to a recognized credential. So it can't just be a high school equivalency class or an ESL class that is adult education. And there are other requirements that I didn't try to summarize on this slide here because I'm trying to give sort of a big picture overview as opposed to a detail about everything. This funding will become available on July 1st for the upcoming academic year. But again, it's for programs that have been up and running for a year already. So what does this mean for adult educators, right? I just gave you a whole bunch of information and some of you might be thinking, well, that's nice, Amanda, but I don't work for a community college and I'm not sure how this is relevant to me. So the first thing that I recommend doing is checking in with your program director to see if there's any appetite at your organization for figuring out if this funding stream might be something your organization would want to try to explore. I would also connect with your state higher education agency to see what they're doing in supporting educational institutions as they implement Workforce Pell. You might also want to take a look at your integrated education and training programs, which many of you call IET, some of you call them iBest or by other names, to see if the skills training component could align with the Workforce Pell criteria. You could also take a look at your learner data to see if there are current or prospective learners on your wait list who might be Pell eligible and for whom if you have a student success case manager or a navigator position in your organization, you might want to make sure that they're able to give students advice about this new opportunity. I'm going to pause here and again look in the chat and just see if there are let's see here. Okay, I see a question here on regulatory changes. So the short answer is we don't yet know if there are any forthcoming proposed rules around adult education specifically. If anything comes out, National Skills Coalition will certainly be covering it. There is a question in the chat about which adult education or short-term workforce programs are most likely to benefit from Workforce Pell. Um, so the short answer is if you have a program that's been up and running for a while and has a good graduation rate and a good job placement rate, and you've been paying for it with other sources, right? So you haven't been using Pell Grant money to pay for it. You're in a better position to be able to tap in to Pell Grant money relatively sooner rather than later. Again, assuming that your organization is accredited under the Higher Education Act. Um, uh, I see Daniel's comment around, what kinds of institutions might be approved by the Department of Ed to accept federal student financial aid. Yeah, it's a complicated area, and I'm not trying to list out every variable here. Um, And yes, Angie's making a comment in the chat about the outcomes required under Workforce Pell. Some of these are written into the statute that Congress passed, and some of these are part of the negotiated rulemaking process that the Department of Education has just concluded. So it's complicated, but I wanted to flag this as a potential area because it's something I haven't heard a lot of adult ed leaders talking about at this point. Um, I like Amber's comment in the chat that, a lot of programs in her state don't currently collect job placement rates, so it's going to be a big lift, but also potentially a big opportunity, right? Um, okay, so I'm going to move on to the next portion of my conversation here and make sure that we have time to cover the two other areas that I wanted to cover today. So something else that was included in that big bill that Congress passed last summer are some expanded work requirements. So there are tens of millions of Americans who receive either Medicaid benefits, which are health coverage for low-income people, or SNAP benefits, which used to be known as the food stamp program, also for low-income people. The legislation that just passed last summer is greatly expanding the number of people on these programs who are now subject to work requirements. Work requirements typically mean that you have to prove to your state, typically your state Department of Human Services or the equivalent, that you are engaged in qualifying activities for 80 hours a month, which works out to about 20 hours a week. Now, those activities could be work, as in a job, community service, as in kind of volunteering, participating in an educational program, participating in a work or job training program, or some combination of the above. Now, there have been work requirements for other federal programs for a long time, but there have never been work requirements that applied to so many new people all at once. And I'm going to talk about what that means for adult education in just a moment. But first, I'm going to switch from Medicaid to SNAP. So I just talked about the Medicaid work requirements. The SNAP work requirements have also greatly expanded the number of people who now need to meet the work requirements. And the work requirements under SNAP are pretty similar to Medicaid, right? It's still 80 hours a month. It's still a short list of activities that count as qualifying activities. Slightly different list, but pretty similar. SNAP has this really unlovely term of ABOD, able-bodied adults without dependents. The law that Congress passed last summer raised the age limit of who's subject to work requirements. It used to be that some folks in their 50s and 60s were not required. Now, all the way up to age 64, you are required to abide by work requirements if you are one of these able-bodied adults without dependents. They also removed some exceptions related to individuals who are homeless or individuals coming out of the foster care system. I'm not going to try to go through the nuances of those changes because I think the big picture for adult education folks to be aware of is that because of this expansion of work requirements our partners in the WIOA Title I side of the system, which is branded different ways in different states, right? These are the American Job Centers that in Michigan, they're called Michigan Work Centers. In Ohio, they're the Ohio Means Job Centers. Every state has their own brand name for them, but they are seeing a very significant increase in client referrals. So I heard from one workforce center, they had received an increase of 1,500 people being referred to their workforce center, their WIOA Title I center. Of the 1,500 people who'd been referred, 100 of those people actually showed up at their doorstep needing services. Now, this is a workforce center whose um, largest uh, conference room for enrollments seats 50 people. Now, granted, not all 100 people showed up on the same day, so that was fine. But I wanted to give you a sense of the volume of people we're talking about, right? This is in one, uh, like two county area um, in one Midwestern state. And so as all these people are flowing into your workforce partners, some of them are going to get referred over to you in adult education. And my guess is some of you may already have been seeing this. So what does this mean for adult educators? The first question to ask is my program actually seeing increased referrals of people who are trying to fulfill their work requirements? Are you getting more? Are you not getting more? Um, Do you want to be getting more? Should you be in closer conversation with your state workforce partners in your local workforce center to clarify when people should or should not be referred to you? Those are questions for you and your program director to think about. Um, the second thing to do is to connect with your Department of Human Services to make sure you know that if any of your learners need to have enrollment paperwork from you or a letter certifying that they're participating in your program, in order to show that they're meeting work requirements, that you know what that paperwork needs to look like. Some of you have probably done this paperwork a million times for learners, right? Maybe you have learners who are on probation or parole and who need to show that they're in a GED class. Maybe you have learners who've been subject to other kinds of work requirements under TANF or other federal programs. Um, but some of you may never have done this before. So this is a good time to check and make sure that your program is set up to do that and figure out whether you need to have an internal policy at your organization to make it as easy as possible for your learners to get whatever paperwork they may need to show, hey, I'm spending 8 hours a week in an adult education class, so that should count towards my work requirement that I have to meet, for this federal program. And again, here I'm going to pause and just see if there are questions. Um, uh, in the chat. Okay, I think we're going to save these questions for the end here because I'm not seeing anything that's an immediate clarifying question. Just oh, Betsy was asking, how can we find out if our state has implemented these requirements? So SNAP is already being implemented. Medicaid is happening on a sort of rolling basis. So your Department of Human Services will almost certainly have a press release or similar on their website that updates what's happening. And if that's not the case, you can also feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to point you to somebody in your state who could answer that question for you. Um, let's see here. Yes, folks will get a copy of the recording and the PowerPoint for today's session. So all of my links and things will be things you can refer to later. Okay, I have one more section I want to go through, and then we're going to go ahead and open up for broader conversation and questions. So some of you may have seen headlines about proposed changes to the immigration public charge regulation. The public charge provision in United States law pertains to when an immigrant is applying for permanent resident or green card status. And it means that the government has to weigh positive factors and negative factors to see if that person is likely to become a public charge, which has traditionally been interpreted to mean, is this person going to become totally dependent on the government for basic living expenses or care? Which is obviously a pretty narrow set of circumstances. And again, it's a totality of circumstances test, which is just a fancy way of saying that they weigh the positive factors and the negative factors in somebody's application. So, for example, a positive factor might have to do with someone's um, level of education or household income or other kinds of factors that would mean that they have resources to depend on, that means that they would not need to depend on the government for support. Under the current rules, we've always been able to reassure adult learners that it's a good thing that they're participating in adult education programs, that will never count against them in their green card application. And that's the really good thing about this standard that has been in place for more than 3 decades now, um, with a minor exception during the end of the first Trump administration. It's a clear, bright line, and it has allowed us to reassure adult learners. Unfortunately, the administration is proposing to roll back that rule and not issue a new rule. So by not having a new rule, there wouldn't be that nice bright line standard anymore. And it would make it much harder for adult educators to reassure learners that participating in adult education programs would not count against them when they're applying for a green card. On the other hand, in the first Trump administration, when the administration tried to change the public charge regulations, there was a lawsuit. I anticipate that there will likely be a lawsuit again if this proposed new rule is enacted. And I have put some very reputable sources for where you can follow this question on the screen here. So that's the end of my planned slides. I'm going to pause here and let Robert tell me which questions he wants to go to first.
I think Amanda, just your thoughts on, there's a number of people who've said, what might you be doing if you were at the local level uh, in response to some of these, how local programs can take advantage of being an aid to some of the things you talked about, helping people out there with work and education requirements, as well as what people might be considering, since some of the things that might be more challenging to our programs. We might need to market even more should we lose access to some of the folks, or folks lose access to us. So what are the things, again, that on the horizon that you might be doing at the local level? And then lastly, always, where might people keep a finger on the pulse of how these things are developing?
Well, the first and most important thing I'm going to say is pick one thing to do at the local level. Don't exhaust yourself trying to respond to everything. We don't all have capacity to do that, and the world is particularly noisy and chaotic right now. So be gentle on yourself and be gentle on your program and your learners, and don't try to respond to everything. I talked about 4 different things today. If you have the energy to engage on appropriations, then please do contact your congresspeople and tell them how important it is to continue funding adult education. Because even though they passed legislation today to do that, the FY27 conversation is starting very soon in Congress. Um, if that's not where you have energy, but you do have energy to ask this question about whether Workforce Pell might be valuable for your learners, then I would lean into that set of questions that I had up on screen for the Workforce Pell slides, and you'll be able to refer back to those when I send the slides out. But sort of asking internally with your program director, hey, is this something we're going to pursue as an organization? Or if not, are there sister organizations that we're connected to, excuse me, or that we refer clients to? can we think about looking at our learners to see if there's anything we want to alert our learners to so that they're aware of this new opportunity? On the Medicaid and SNAP work requirements, again, don't try to be all things to all people. Don't try to solve all the problems. But one question to ask internally is, hey, do we have an easy process for generating a letter or other paperwork for our learners if they need to prove that they are participating in our program? Excuse me, sorry, I'm gonna switch over to a new cough drop here. And then finally, excuse me, sorry about that. Um, when it comes to immigration public charge, that's a wait and see. I would stay tuned for news updates about next steps there. Robert, what's the next question you'd like me to take? I can take a look in the chat here too.
Yeah, I think a lot of them are just are there clarifications. Feel free to take a look at as well, but clarifications regarding specifically how does adult ed fit in to things that we individuals might not already be doing. Uh, so obviously the push toward enhanced IET or certificated programs. A lot of folks now, you shared briefly uh, what someone might be doing. There's also questions on how best can we, like you also briefly mentioned, but maybe some more ideas on helping those that we serve get the best information. So I think those things are continue to be asked is how does this what kind of steps, like you say, what kind of continued steps, and if we gather people together in our organizations, how might we best delegate out responsibilities for these tasks? So like you say, it's not just overwhelming, but we can take a measured approach to these things and do things well.
Yeah, those are important questions. I'm seeing that Ashante is asking whether a high school diploma is required to be eligible for Workforce Pell. Um, so the intersection here is between ability to benefit and Workforce Pell. So ability to benefit is the provision under federal law that allows someone who does not yet have a high school diploma to be eligible for Pell under certain circumstances. So the answer to that question is maybe. Um, maybe they can be eligible for Workforce Pell, depending on the ability to benefit process in your state. And please feel free to follow up with me offline if you need a pointer to who you could talk to in your state about that. Um, there's a question from Sarah. Is Workforce Pell primarily relevant for contextualized programs? Well, yes, because the programs have to include a skills training credential that is a recognized credential under the federal rules, and that is not, a TABE test level gain or a CASAS level gain does not count um, as a recognized credential for the purposes of the Workforce Pell. See a comment in the chat from Linda that TANF work requirements also contradict some of what counts towards other programs. Yes, one of the particularly challenging things about federal law is that sometimes Congress will use the same terminology, like work requirements, in two different pieces of legislation, but they will define it differently. And then there will be regulations and policy guidance issued that further define it differently. So be careful and don't assume that however your state counts work requirements for TANF is going to be exactly how work requirements are defined for SNAP or Medicaid. I know this stuff is ferociously complicated. There are amazing public benefits attorneys who specialize in the nuances of this stuff. Adult educators don't have to become experts. We just have to have the big picture guidance so that we know when a learner brings us a question, that we're not going to give them an answer off the top of our heads based on something we think we remember from TANF, and just somehow assume that that's going to apply in the case of Medicaid or SNAP. Um, let's see what else we're seeing in the chat here. Betsy had a question about what is counted against them. So when I use the phrase counted against them in the public charge test, again, in the public charge test, there's a list of factors that the immigration officer can count for a person or against a person when they're applying for a green card, right? And so if I say, well, Amanda has a college education and a long job history, um, that counts positively for Amanda in the public charge test, because a person who has a college degree and has been working for a long time is definitely less likely to become fully dependent on the government for cash support. On the other hand, if Amanda has needed full-time nursing care, um, then that could count against me in the public charge test, because a person who needs 24/7 nursing care is someone who might become dependent in the long term on the government for support. Again, the value of the existing public charge rule is that it's a nice bright line, and it lets us as adult educators say very comfortingly and clearly to our learners, don't worry, participating in adult education will never count against you as a use of a government public benefit or something in the public charge test. The proposed change that the Trump administration wants to do would take away that bright line and leave everybody kind of in the dark and guessing. I have a whole blog post about this if you want to kind of go deep on the details. And in the slides that I created for all of you today, I also linked to 3 really reputable nonprofit organizations that have really terrific public charge related resources. I'm going to link to my public charge blog here in the chat, just so that folks also have the link here. Okay, let's see what other questions we have in the chat. Okay. Shelley, I'm going to ask you to expand on your question. I'm not sure what you mean when you say, how does that affect refugee education program? Can you be a little more specific about which refugee program you're thinking of? Margaret is asking, is there a plan to move adult education to the Department of Labor? The federal government has moved some staff from OCTE, which is the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education, over from the Department of Education to the Department of Labor as part of what's called an IAA, an interagency agreement, which is fancy lawyer talk for a piece of paper that explains what's the part that the Department of Labor is going to do and what's the part the Department of Education is going to do. They can't change everything because some things are mandated by Congress. But the part that the president does have control over, the administration has moved to move those education employees over to the Department of Labor. I see Brian asking a question about SNAP employment and training. I think the answer to your question, Brian, is make sure you are talking to the wonderful folks at the Seattle Jobs Initiative. They are a national resource in supporting nonprofits and others that want to access SNAP employment and training funds. SNAP ENT is a subset of the much, much larger SNAP program. And we don't have time today for me to go into all the details of SNAP ENT, but I would highly recommend reaching out to the SNAP ENT. I think they call it a Center of Excellence or National Resource Center, something similar to that, being run by the Seattle Jobs Initiative. There's some really excellent materials that they've put out to help understand. Okay, Tammy asked this question about, can you explain the difference from the skinny budget where adult ed was zeroed out versus the bills passing funding for adult education? The skinny budget is the president's wish list. you can think about it with any president of any political party. It's kind of their letter to Santa Claus. This is what I want for Christmas. Is Santa Claus going to bring that? Eh, Congress is the one that controls the purse strings. Congress is the one that decides how money is spent. So this year, Congress looked at the president's wish list, and the House said, "Oh, we would go along with the president's desire to zero out adult ed funding." And the Senate said, "No, we're going to level fund it." And the Senate won. And so, yeah, the president put on his wish list that he wanted to zero out adult education. That wish did not get granted. But one of the reasons it didn't get granted is because so many people on this call advocated with their elected officials for the value of adult education. And I think it's really important to emphasize. I know some of you are active with COABE, who has done a huge amount of advocacy in this area. Some of you advocate through your state associations or as individuals. It was your hard work that made the Senate have enough of a backbone to say, no, we're not going to zero this out. We're going to level fund it.
And Amanda,
Yeah, sorry,
I
go ahead,
see
Robert.
it. I see it coming up, and I know it wasn't on our original. But even if you could give just the briefest overview on, and I'm going to pronounce it incorrectly, Perora, and I'll let you because and just what might that mean a decision tree here, particularly if that goes into effect, what we might want to be doing to continue to serve as many people as possible should some individuals be excluded, and but just in general, what is it, and how might we keep on top of how that is progressing? Thank you.
We're doing all the most ferociously complicated parts of federal immigration law today. So PROWARA stands for the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Just rolls right off the tongue there. It is the 1996 welfare reform law. Um, Under that law, there's a list of public benefits um, that immigrants are not allowed to receive. This administration has issued a set of new policy interpretations that challenge the 30-year-old understanding of what does and doesn't count as a public benefit. And many states, there's ongoing litigation on this topic, so I'm not going to try to summarize all the details. Um, but the long story short is that the Trump administration is trying to make it a much longer list of what would count as a public benefit under PROWARA. And in particular, they're attempting to put some education-related programs as public benefits under PROWARA. Importantly, they can't change the law without Congress. And there are some things that are in the statute that Congress passed in 1996 as the welfare reform law. And then there's a lot of stuff that's not in the statute. And that's the kind of thing that is a part of the litigation that 20 some states have brought on related questions. Folks want to go into more detail about this question, I'm happy to chat offline, with more details. Let me just see if there's anything else. There is a question about whether IELCE might have a higher level of vulnerability than other adult ed funds. Informally, I can tell you the answer to that question is sadly yes. There's no good reason for that to be true, but it remains true that many people on Capitol Hill don't really know what IELCE does, and therefore they're vulnerable to being persuaded by colleagues of theirs who want to do away with the program. So if you get IELCE funding, you should absolutely be educating Congress about why this funding is important and why it needs to continue. Let's see. Looking at the rest of the comments in the chat. So I see a wonderful question here on family and two-generation models. And I think there's two answers to this question. I'm going to give the discouraging one first and then the more encouraging one. So the discouraging one is, look, Congress passed legislation in 2014 that said they see adult education as a workforce development activity. That's the focus. So if you want to fund family literacy, you should probably be advocating for other funding for that to happen. And indeed, a handful of states have done that. Um, that's the discouraging piece, right? Congress has put adult ed in WIOA, and WIOA is workforce focused. The encouraging piece, right, is that we all know that people are more than just workers, that they are grandparents supporting their children's or grandchildren's K-12 education, that they need to be able to navigate telehealth appointments, that they are participating as civic, participants in society. And so family literacy, I think, has a really important role to play in educating elected officials about why this more holistic view of adult education is valuable and important, not at the expense of workforce, but in addition to workforce. And again, happy to chat more about that uh, afterwards. Okay, I think this is about all of the information I wanted to make sure that I shared with you today. I want to make sure that we get to any additional pending questions that Robert or the team may have seen in the chat that I perhaps have missed. Is there anything else, Robert, that you want to make sure we cover or affirm or clarify?
Yeah, can't give enough shout out to all the work that COABE has been doing just each and every day. Sharon Bonney, the board, everyone leading advocacy day in and day out. If you're haven't already planned to be in Indianapolis in a couple months in April, this would be a fantastic time to come together. So want to give a big shout out. Also want to give a big shout out to Dr. Jeff Fantine and National Coalition for Literacy. If you're not already following NCL, I would highly recommend doing that. And in fact, I was so blessed to join up with Jeff's group. There are about 10 of us recently met, particularly with Republican legislators. And so, Amanda, you want to just talk just briefly about that as all of us think of what we can do from an advocacy side, what you feel resonated with our time on the Hill, and then also just a moment of what the kind of guardrails that look to have be in this new WIOA that can help us particularly avoid what happened with funding last summer.
Yeah. Um, so first question first, what resonated with folks on Capitol Hill? Again, the more specific you can be, the better, right? So when we walk into a congressperson's office and we say, this is the number of learners in your district that are benefiting from these funds. This is the number of people in your district that don't yet have a high school diploma um, and need the opportunity to pursue adult education. That specificity matters. It also really helps when you can hook it to whatever is most of interest to the congressperson. So that really depends on your particular elected official. I always recommend going to their press page on their website and look at their last 5 press releases to see what they're discussing. Some elected officials will be talking about their support for the Navy. That's a great opportunity to talk to them about how adult education is a critical foundation for people who might want to join the armed services, right? Some Congress people will be talking about the importance of STEM careers or artificial intelligence. That's a great opportunity to talk about adult education as the foundation for helping people move into those kinds of industries and careers. Some elected officials will be leaning on the importance of small business and supporting the small businesses in their communities. And so that's an opportunity to talk about how, if you're a big company, you can march down the street to a local community college and have them design a training program just for you. But if you're a small business, you depend on the adult education system and other partners to help provide training for the workers that you're hiring. And so thinking about adult ed as a small business support can be valuable. So again, my recommendation whenever you're meeting with an elected official is look at what they've said publicly is important to them. Look at what they brag about in their newsletter or what they issue press releases about, and then figure out how adult education connects to that story. And I think that can help you kind of get over the hump of, well, what am I going to talk about or how am I going to make the case for the work that we're trying to do? Robert, I think there was a second half to your question that I want to make sure that I get to.
Just those items that, again, can't thank enough, to COABE and everybody in all of adult education for, I believe, some provisions as far as what can and cannot be done with adult education funds. There were some concerns that it might not be
Yeah,
used the way, and also how possibly we avoid what happened last summer.
yeah. Look, there's what's written down on paper, and then there's what happens in real life. And the most powerful thing that all of you as adult educators did last summer was you spoke out with your voices to say to Congress, hey, you have to make what's written down on paper become reality. Because on paper, it says Congress gets to decide what happens with adult education money, and Congress says it should be spent. But in reality, the federal government was holding up that funding. So there are some guardrails, or at least I haven't seen the version of the language that passed today in Congress. But in the latest version I saw, there were some guardrails in there that specified from Congress to the administration that adult education money had to be spent in a particular way. But I don't think these battles are over. I think we're going to need your voices again to keep reminding your elected officials Congress is in charge of the budget. It says so in all our founding documents, right? Congress has the power of the purse. And it's important that when Congress tells any administration, any president of any party how money is to be spent, that that president follows the law. And I anticipate we may need to have your voices raised again this year to remind Congress of that. But remember, we won last year, we can win this year. And I think that's a good note to wrap up on.
I was going to say, on a winning note there, again, thank you so much, Amanda. Covered an incredible amount of ground, gave us great insights on what next steps to follow. And again, if you're not already following Amanda on LinkedIn and all of social media and the National Skills Coalition, I can't encourage you more strongly to do so. So thanks for your valuable time. And with the National Skills Coalition Summit coming up in hours practically in Washington, D.C. Once again, this webinar was recorded, will be available on our website by tomorrow. You'll also receive a follow-up email from us. It will have the certificate of attendance as well as Amanda's PowerPoint. And again, please share widely and freely this information with all of your colleagues because we genuinely need each and every one of your voices now and pretty much every month moving forward. So with that, Robert Breitbart, Director of Educational Partnerships with Burlington English. And speaking of which, please reach out to us at Burlington English. We've got more than 100 folks in the field, and we would definitely love to help you reach all of these efforts that you're going to be looking to accomplish every day moving forward. Once again, thank you to Amanda, and have a great rest of your day. Be well now. Bye-bye.